There's a scene that plays out in so many backyards every summer. A tomato plant turns yellow, a pepper stops growing, or a perfect zucchini suddenly loses its vigor. And most of us immediately think about diseases, pests, or even pulling the whole plant out to just start all over again. But many times, it's actually something way simpler. Your plant isn't sick. The plant is just hungry. And by hungry, I don't mean it needs more water. I mean that the soil can no longer provide some of the key nutrients it needs to keep growing the way it normally should. The interesting part is that plants usually warn us way before the problem gets too serious. One of the main signs is leaves losing their deep color, growth slowing down, fewer flowers showing up, or smaller fruits. These are signs that very often go completely unnoticed. And that's where today's topic begins, because there are homemade liquid fertilizers that can deliver quick nutrients using stuff we usually throw in the trash. We're not talking about miracle products here. We're not going to bring a dead plant back to life, but we can definitely help a weak plant get some of its strength back while we keep improving the fertility of the soil. And the first of these fertilizers is something you've probably tossed out hundreds of times without knowing its true garden value. Onion skins. Before you throw your next onion skin into the garbage, let me ask you a question. Which part of the onion do you think holds the most minerals? The white part we use for cooking, or the dry, brown skin that usually ends up all the way at the bottom of the trash can? Most people would choose the onion itself, the white part, but the reality is actually way more surprising. Those outer layers are a real nutrient goldmine. In them, we find potassium, calcium, magnesium, and small amounts of iron. Minerals involved in vital processes for plant development. And if you grow tomatoes, peppers, or eggplants, there's one that deserves a special shout-out: potassium. Because potassium helps regulate water movement within the plant, takes part in forming flowers and fruits, and also improves resistance against stress caused by the summer heat. That's why it's often considered one of the most important nutrients during the flowering and production phase. Now, this is where many people make a mistake. They hear onion skins contain nutrients and bury them directly next to the plant, expecting quick results. And while it's not wrong, it has a downside. It's a slow process. The skins need weeks to break down and release all those minerals into the soil. Meanwhile, the plant keeps waiting. That's why there's a much faster way to use them. Making an onion skin tea is extremely simple. We only need a handful of dry skins and about 1 quart of water. We put them in a container and let the mixture sit for 24 to 48 hours. During that time, some of the minerals transfer to the water. Gradually, the liquid starts turning an amber color, similar to a light herbal tea, and that's the good sign. It means the extraction is working. Once it's ready, I prefer using it diluted at 50%. Meaning, 1 part onion tea and 1 part clean water. This way, we get a mild and safe mixture to apply around the plants. And I want to emphasize something important. This isn't a miracle fertilizer. It's not going to transform a sick plant into a perfect one overnight, but it can provide a small nutrient boost and help plants that are starting to flower or form fruits. Plus, we're making use of something that would normally end up in the trash, and that's exactly what several of the fertilizers we'll see today have in common. But the next one is completely different because it's not meant to feed the plant directly, it's meant to feed something even more important. The life that exists within the soil. If I ask you what you do with the water you use to rinse rice before cooking it, you'll probably answer that you pour it down the sink. And that's completely normal. Most of us have done it our whole lives, but it turns out that water contains a lot more than it seems. When we rinse rice, some of the starches, vitamins, and minerals transfer to the water. And while fresh water can already have some value for the garden, the really interesting part happens a few days later, when we let it ferment. And this is where many people discover a concept that completely changes how they understand growing, because it's not all about feeding the plant directly. We also have to feed the soil, and more specifically, the millions of microorganisms living in it, bacteria, beneficial fungi, and other microscopic organisms that work constantly around the roots. Even though we can't see them, they're the ones helping to break down organic matter, release nutrients, and create a healthy environment for plant growth. That's why a living soil usually produces stronger plants, and that's where fermented rice water comes in. Making it is very simple. After rinsing the rice, we save the water in a container or a jar with a lid. No need to fill it all the way. We let it sit for 3 to 5 days in a shaded spot at room temperature. As the days go by, you'll notice something curious. The water starts to get a slight sour smell, similar to a mild yogurt or a very light sourdough starter. And that is precisely the sign we are looking for, because it indicates that beneficial microorganisms have started to develop. Now, there's one very important detail. Before using it, we must dilute it. I recommend about 1 part rice water to 10 parts clean water. This way, we prevent the fermentation from being too strong for the roots. Once diluted, we can apply it directly to the soil around the plants, not on the leaves, on the soil. The goal is to stimulate the microbial life that exists around their roots. And here is the most important difference compared to the previous fertilizer. Onion tea provides nutrients. Fermented rice water helps create a more active soil. It's like the difference between giving a plate of food to someone or building a kitchen where they can cook every day. Both things are useful, but they serve different functions. And that's exactly why many people use both formulas at different times of the season. But if we're talking about giving fast and visible nutrients, the next fertilizer is probably the most powerful of all the ones we'll see, because it's made with veggie scraps that would normally end up in the trash. There's a curious thing that happens in almost every kitchen. We buy veggies, make a salad, cook a meal, and slowly, scraps that nobody wants to eat start piling up. A tomato that's too ripe, lettuce forgotten in the fridge, a cucumber starting to wrinkle, or the outer layers of a cabbage end up in the trash. But for the garden, these scraps still have value because they actually still contain a large part of the nutrients the plant absorbed during its growth. And here is where one of the most important ideas in agriculture appears. A plant doesn't stop growing because it lacks all nutrients. Usually, it stops growing because it lacks just one. There is a theory known as Liebig's law of the minimum that explains exactly this. Imagine a barrel made of wooden staves of different heights. It doesn't matter how high the other staves are, the amount of water the barrel can hold will always be limited by the shortest stave. With plants, the exact same thing happens. There could be plenty of phosphorus, plenty of potassium, plenty of calcium, but if nitrogen is missing, growth will stall just the same. And nitrogen is precisely one of the nutrients that our vegetables consume the most. That's why this liquid fertilizer is so interesting. To make it, we simply need vegetable scraps, ripe tomatoes, lettuce, spinach, cucumbers, chard, or any other type of kitchen veggie. We put them in a bucket, add enough water to cover them, and place some weight on top to keep them submerged, and from there, all you need is patience. For about 2 weeks, microorganisms will start breaking down the plant tissues, and slowly, the nutrients will transfer to the water. When the process is finished, we get a dark liquid with quite an odor, and even though it might not be particularly pleasant, it's a good sign. It means the fermentation has done its job. Now, here comes the most important part. We must never use this liquid directly. As I mentioned with the previous liquids, it must always be diluted. I recommend about 1 part fertilizer to 30 parts water. This one is more powerful, so we have to tone it down much more. It might seem like a lot, but remember we are working with a highly concentrated solution. Once diluted, we can apply it around the plants, especially at times when we want to promote vegetative growth, for example, on young tomato plants, peppers that are just taking off, or plants showing slow growth. And something I particularly like about this method is that it transforms waste into resources. What would normally have ended up in the bin goes back to the garden turned into nutrients. But if we want to go one step further, there is a mix capable of providing several different nutrients at the same time. A sort of complete fertilizer made with ingredients you probably already have in your house right now. Up until now, we've seen fertilizers that stand out for one specific thing. Onion tea mainly provides minerals like potassium. Fermented rice water helps stimulate microbial life in the soil, and fermented veggie scraps can provide nutrients related to growth. But many times, a plant doesn't have a single need. What it needs is a little bit of everything. And that's where this complete homemade fertilizer comes in. A simple mix that combines several ingredients we normally find in any kitchen. Each one brings something different, and together they form a very interesting formula for the garden. The first ingredient is banana peels, probably the most well-known of all. Banana peels contain potassium, a very important nutrient for flowering, fruit formation, and regulating water within the plant. That's why it's usually used especially on tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, and other fruiting vegetables. The second ingredient is eggshells. Here we find calcium, and if you grow tomatoes, you surely already know why it's important. Calcium takes part in forming the plant's cell walls. When there are problems related to its absorption, well-known disorders like blossom end rot can appear, that blackening that shows up at the bottom of some tomatoes. The third ingredient is used coffee grounds. And I want to pause for a moment because there is a lot of confusion about them. For years, it's been repeated that coffee grounds heavily acidify the soil, but when we talk about grounds already used to brew coffee, the effect on the pH is usually much lower than people imagine. Their main value isn't so much in modifying the soil as it is in providing organic matter that will gradually incorporate into the ground. The fourth ingredient is Epsom salt, meaning magnesium sulfate. Magnesium is part of chlorophyll, the pigment responsible for the green color of leaves and for photosynthesis. When a plant has an actual magnesium deficiency, yellow leaves can appear while the veins remain green. But we should be careful here. Not all yellow leaves indicate a lack of magnesium. That's why we should never think that Epsom salt is the universal solution for every problem. And finally, we have a less-known ingredient, molasses. Molasses provides small amounts of minerals, but above all, it serves as an energy source for the beneficial microorganisms involved in breaking down organic matter. To put it simply, it helps speed up the biological processes happening inside the mix. To prepare this fertilizer, we can use 2 chopped banana peels, several crushed eggshells, a handful of used coffee grounds, a tablespoon of Epsom salt, and a tablespoon of molasses. We add about 1 quart of warm water and let the mixture sit for 3 to 5 days. Then, we strain the liquid and dilute it before using it. I recommend about 1 part mixture to 10 parts water, and always applying it to the soil around the roots, never on the leaves. It's not meant to replace good compost or proper soil fertilization, but it can become a very interesting tool to complement your crops during the season. And though this mix provides many different nutrients, there is still a traditional fertilizer that has been used since long before modern fertilizers existed. A fertilizer that for centuries fed gardens and crops all over the world. Manure tea. Long before modern fertilizers existed, farmers already knew something we still use today. If you want healthy plants, first you have to feed the soil. And for centuries, one of the most used resources to achieve this was manure. In fact, before the arrival of synthetic fertilizers, practically every garden in the world depended on it. And although today we have many more options, it remains one of the most interesting tools we can use. Mind you, there is a huge difference between applying manure correctly and doing it wrong, because using it incorrectly can cause more problems than benefits. That's why the first thing we must be clear about is a fundamental rule. We will never use fresh manure. Freshly produced manure contains high amounts of ammonia and other compounds that can damage the roots. Plus, it can introduce weed seeds or unwanted microorganisms. The ideal way is to always work with cured manure aged for several months. And here is where a very interesting advantage appears. We can prepare a liquid fertilizer that allows us to make use of some of its nutrients quickly. The famous manure tea. Making it is quite simple. We place a small amount of mature manure inside a cloth bag, a mesh, or even an old pillowcase. Then we put the bag inside a bucket of water. From that moment on, something similar happens to when we brew a tea. The most soluble nutrients slowly begin to transfer to the water. For 3 to 5 days, the liquid will gradually take on color. Once the process is finished, we will have a liquid fertilizer rich in nutrients. Now, not all manures are the same, and this is something worth knowing. For example, chicken manure is usually one of the richest in nitrogen, which is why it can be very interesting for stimulating the growth of plants that need to regain their vigor. Cow manure tends to be more balanced and has traditionally been used to improve general soil fertility. And then we have a favorite of many gardeners, rabbit manure, because it's usually milder, easier to handle, and highly valued in home gardens. Once the tea is ready, another vital step comes up, dilution. We must never use it directly. It seems like I'm repeating myself a lot, as I've been saying it for all 5, but it must be done. The standard practice is to dilute about 1 part tea to 10 parts clean water. The result should look like a light tea, not a dark coffee. And once diluted, we apply it directly to the soil around the roots, preferably early in the morning or late in the afternoon. When temperatures are milder, and the plant can make better use of the nutrients. What I like most about this fertilizer is that it doesn't just provide nutrients, it also helps feed soil life. And when a soil is alive, plants usually respond in a completely different way. But after seeing these 5 fertilizers, an important question comes up. Which one is the best? When should you use each one? And above all, which one would I use in each garden situation? That is precisely what we are going to look at right now. After seeing all these homemade fertilizers, it's normal to ask yourself a question. Which one is best? And the answer is probably not what you expect, because none of them is the best for everything. Each one has a different function, and understanding when to use each one can make a huge difference in the garden. For example, if you have a tomato plant that is starting to flower and you want to help it during flower and fruit formation, onion skin tea can be an interesting option thanks to its potassium boost. It won't work miracles, but it can complement a balanced fertilization very well. If your goal is to improve the soil's biological activity, especially after a period of intense heat or in lands poor in organic matter, fermented rice water can become a great ally. That's because it's not designed to feed the plant directly, it's designed to stimulate the life that exists around the roots. When what you're looking for is to promote vegetative growth, for example, in young tomato plants, newly established peppers, or plants that seem to have stalled. Fermented veggie scraps are usually one of the most interesting options, especially because they can provide many nutrients related to growth. Then we have the mix we talked about with banana peels, eggshells, coffee grounds, Epsom salt, and molasses. I see it as a pretty balanced option to provide several different nutrients at the same time. All of this doesn't replace good compost, it doesn't replace proper soil fertilization, but it can be an interesting complement during the season. And finally, we have manure tea, probably the most traditional of all and also one of the most complete when prepared correctly. If I had to choose one to maintain the garden's fertility, it would certainly be among my top choices. But here comes something very important. Many gardeners obsess over finding the perfect fertilizer. And the reality is that the true secret isn't usually in the fertilizer, it's in the soil. Because a poor soil will keep giving you problems even if you add fertilizer every week. Meanwhile, a soil rich in organic matter, full of life, and well cared for usually produces much healthier plants with way less intervention. That's why I always say that these fertilizers are tools, useful tools, interesting tools, but they don't replace something more important, building a fertile soil. And precisely right there is where the most valuable lesson of this entire video is found. After everything we've seen today, it's easy to just walk away with a list of recipes: onion skin tea, fermented rice water, fermented veggie scraps, the complete kitchen mix, manure tea. And yes, all of them can bring something interesting to the garden, but if I had to summarize this video in a single idea, it would be this: the goal is not to feed the plant, the goal is to feed the soil. Because when a soil is healthy, incredible things happen. It retains moisture better, stores more nutrients, develops greater biological activity, and roots find a much more favorable environment to grow. Many times we look for quick fixes, one fertilizer for yellow leaves, another for flowering, another for growth. And while these tools can help, none of them replaces a fertile soil full of life. So, if you really want to improve your garden year after year, try to think beyond the plant right in front of you. Think about the soil beneath your feet. Add organic matter. Use compost whenever you can. Protect the ground with mulch, avoid leaving it bare for months, and little by little you'll see how each season becomes easier than the last, because a time will come when your plants need less help, fewer corrections, less fertilizer, and they'll simply grow better. What I like most about all these homemade fertilizers isn't that they're free, or even that they use waste. It's that they remind us of something that was part of agriculture for generations, that many of the resources we need are already all around us, and that sometimes what we consider waste still has a second life in the garden. So the next time a tomato plant starts turning yellow, a pepper stops growing, or a plant seems to lose its strength, don't run out immediately to buy a new product. Observe first. Listen to what the plant is trying to tell you, and remember that many times the solution starts long before the fertilizer, it starts in the soil. Thank you so much for joining me one more day. I hope some of these homemade fertilizers help you get more out of your garden and, above all, help you better understand how the soil beneath your plants works. And if this video was helpful to you, you can support me with a like and subscribe so you don't miss the next videos. Whichever way you support the channel, I truly appreciate it, and as always, enjoy your garden, take care of the land, and the land will take care of your plants. See you very soon in the next video.